All right, we're going to go over several different ways that you can lay out your page. Again, pages tend to have certain kinds of layouts. There's certain kind that are sort of standard. And what we want to be able to do is take whatever layout that we have sketched out in our wireframe, and we want to actually make web pages by being able to create CSS that does that. So last time we went over sort of this layout where we have our page, a banner on the top, navigation, content, and then the footer. We have our header, our nav, content area, and then our footer. And in this model, this is the only thing that changes from page to page. So we make a template that contains all this stuff in it and contains a placeholder for this, and then we clone it over and over and over again. And ideally, we want to make sure that we have the header, the navigation, and the footer all set before we start cloning it, because at that point, we have multiple copies of the page and we'll have to make that change in multiple places. So today we're going to look at a little bit different layout that is also very popular, where the header's on the top of the page, the navigation's on the side, we have our content area, and a footer. So we're going to look at a few different ways to come up with that. And as we go over these ways, I'll have some comments about when to use them and what's a better way to use them and so on. I like to get through as many of these as possible today, but we probably will cover some of them when we get back from break. A reminder to you, next Monday, the week of next week is spring break. So there will be no in-person class or video for that week. All right. So let's look at our third prototype. And all of these prototypes, by the way, are built off of the same HTML files. I created a template, then cloned it to make my homepage and a couple of my other pages for the full prototype. Usually your homepage is going to be called index.html. So I double click this, and here we have this design. We have our banner on the top. We have navigation on the side, and we have then our content area with our footer at the very bottom. Now, one thing we notice about this is that this is sort of frozen in place. In other words, this is using absolute numbers for these different sizes. Which, again, has the advantage of you can get a very precise layout and have things laid out exactly the way you want them. It does have the disadvantage of looking the same way in every platform, being the same size. In other words, if we had a giant monitor, this stuff would just take up a small portion of the screen, whereas if we had a small monitor, it would take over the full screen. So let's look at the style sheet that creates this. If you notice, I have a slightly different appearance for the Iceland page. I have a different image in the header. The rest of the pages all look the same. So we'll see how we do that, because a common question I get from students is, what if we have one page that's different than the rest of the pages on the site? So let's look at the index for this. And we'll bring it up in Visual Studio Code. Right, I have the same HTML as before. I'm not even sure why I've showed this to you, but maybe just to prove that we have our Google fonts here. It's going to use that font from Google. We have our style sheet, and then we have the same main sections. It's important that you divide your page into main sections like this, because what we're really going to do is we're really going to position those main sections. And for the most part, we're not going to do too much to control inside those sections what it looks like. Usually the browser takes care of business in that regard and displays it pretty well. So we have our header, our nav section, a section for content that consists of several paragraphs, finally a footer, and then the ending tags. Let's look at the CSS for this. All right. We have on the body, we have background and color. It's defining the background color of the page and the color to be used for the font. So actually, even though the font is actually dark, it might look like black. Actually, the font is actually just a shade of dark gray. Now let's look at the header. The header, we have a background URL of bg.jpg. And again, that will be in the same folder as everything. We had talked earlier about what if it was in a different folder, but our background JPEG is in the same folder. So we make it the background of just the header section, because that's the thing that has the URL. Now, again, I think I mentioned this before. We could actually say background color and background image. But the browser's smart enough, if you say background and you have a color, that it knows that you want to change the background color. Likewise, if you have background and you have the URL for an image, it knows that you mean background image. Now, we have something that's different from before. We have a top, a left, and position absolute. Position absolute means that this piece of content, the header, is going to be glued in this position on the page. Absolute. It means it doesn't depend on anything else. It will always be put at this position of the page. What position it is that? 10 pixels from the top, 10 pixels from the left. So 10 pixels from the top, 10 pixels from the left. We put this header section. Width we have hard-coded as 800 pixels. Margin 0 auto. That really isn't relevant here. Padding is 15, so there's 15 pixels between the edge of the header and the text. Text align is centered, so it's centered within that area. And the border is solid black 2 pixels. Again, the browser is smart enough to know that when you say border solid black 2 pixels, that you're actually talking about the border style, the border color, and the border width. I could put those in individually if I wanted to, but I usually don't. The key thing that is different for this one is that I put these positions in. So it doesn't matter, that's glued in that position. If I scroll, it scrolls off the page. It's glued in the position at the very top of this page, and if we scroll and it disappears, it scroll and we disappear. H1, we give a different font family for. Again, we give multiple font families just in case the browser doesn't have one of the fonts. We go in order. We'll first look for Helvetica, then we'll look for Arial, then sans serif. On the H1, it's going to be looking for Garamond and then serif. Our navigation has a background color of this, which is not exactly white. I don't know what you'd call that, a cream or a tan color. Very light. The width we've defined as 200 pixels. The width. The top we've defined as 150, so it's 150 pixels from the top, 10 pixels from the left, and position absolute. So this now is down 150 from the top, and it's still 10 pixels from the left, so it lines up with this other thing. Notice for both the header and the navigation, we don't specify a height. We don't specify a height that makes it as tall as it needs to be. So I could go in there and put a height here. Height of 200 pixels, let's say. I could save it and makes it that big. Well, I want to mess with that and have to figure out exactly how big that's going to be on our screen. So we say simply omit the height. We'll make it as big as it needs to be. All right, nav, UL, and LI. List style type is none. What does that do? That gets rid of the dots before them. So if I eliminated that, no longer have the dots in front of it. We've made the style type of the list have no bullet points. All right, here is interesting. All right. We've made the display inline block. And that is an interesting thing to use for this. We probably could have done this a few different ways, but what inline block says is it's going to act inline, but it's also going to act like a block. Because we can't do certain things like set the margin or padding on an inline tag, but we can do that to a block tag. In this case, it really doesn't matter. We take this off. Actually, it does matter. I take this off. And it's not able to apply the width and the border correctly. It sizes it like it was a inline tag. It ignores the width. So I want it to take the width, even though this is still going to be an inline. I could make it block, and I think the same thing would happen. It would work the same. I could have made that block. So make a block or inline block in order for the width and the border to take the way that I want it to. Size 1.2 EM, that means that the text of the link is slightly bigger than normal text. Border we talked about, padding we talked about, text decoration of none indicates that these links are not underlined. And we specify a color of the text and the background color of the link. Now we do just the opposite when the link is hovered over. We make the background be the yellow color and the color of the text to be this dark, very dark, grayish kind of color. So the colors kind of invert. So it almost looks like we're pressing on a button. All right, section. Again, the key features of this is that there is a width, a top, and a left. What that will do is, again, it will make it, I carefully added up these widths so that it would cover the entire width of the header. So these things would line up on this side as well. Position absolute, it's going to be 300 pixels from the left and 150 from the top. So it will line with the top of this, and it'll be over 300 pixels. What happens if I don't put a position here? If I don't put a position here, it puts it in what's called the flow of the page. If you remember back the first few web pages we developed before we got into CSS, the things on the page were stacked from the top to the bottom. So you had your first block element on the top, the second one underneath it, the third one underneath it, and so on. That's called the flow layout. A flow layout is essentially when you have no layout in CSS. So that just puts things starting at the top and going down. If you omit any sort of styling in the CSS to style the position, it will put things in that flow layout. So therefore, essentially, we have things overlapping each other. Set the font to Poppins, which we can do because we have set that font from Google using one of their fonts. And that is about it for this layout. Top is 1700 pixels. And so on. You can imagine the problem with this. The problem with this is that you have to know just how many pixels this is going to be for this to work. That's not always obvious. And if things change, then your layout's going to change. So although this is a technique that's used, I wouldn't necessarily recommend that you use this very often. Use this when you want a very precise layout on your page. But some of the other techniques we're going to show are going to make more sense. What we can do to improve this a little bit is we could set some of these widths to be relative. So for example, I could put the width of this to be, instead of 800 pixels, I could say the width is 100%. Instead of the width of this being 150 pixels, I could say the width is 50%. Maybe even 70%. I don't want that. The width for this, I could make 100%. I would say this is a little bit better way to do it because, as you can see, the things are going to size themselves based on the width of the window. So as the window gets wider, it's on the wrong place. It's a little bit better because as the page gets wider, this thing fills the space more. This, again, this image is going to tile if we do this, which again, you'd have to decide if you wanted that or if you wanted to change it to be some other way. Now, if you notice, I had Iceland appear differently. I had Iceland appear with a different CSS file. Now, does that mean that I will go in and I will make a completely brand new CSS file? No. I only need to create a new CSS file that has the stuff that's different for Iceland. So, if I go in and edit this, HTML, notice I have two style sheets. I have style and Iceland. And the only thing that's in Iceland is the thing that I want to be different. And in this case, what I want to be different is the background image of this. So I say background URL Iceland. How does that work if you have two style sheets? The second one overrules the first. So if I set a property in style, if Iceland.css has that same property, what's in the second one is going to overrule the first one. So the position of these matter. So like if I switch these around, the second one overruled the first. But I don't want that. I mean, the first one would overrule the second. Style would overrule Iceland. I shouldn't say second and first. I should say my original style sheet would overrule the Iceland one because the last style sheet always applies. So I'm going to put the Iceland style sheet last, and then the page will get this as the property. So if you have a page where you want to be a little bit different than the other pages, that's one technique you can use. You can have your main style sheet for most of the stuff on the page, and then you can have just a little mini style sheet that contains the stuff that's going to be different on the special page. So again, notice I didn't have code a complete brand new style sheet. I just coded that one attribute, made sure it was second, and then that overruled what I had for the first. Right. Onward and upward. Prototype 4. This looks the same. It's also fixed, which has its disadvantages. Look a little different. And I have a scrolling content area for the height. Let's look at the CSS that does this. Close the other ones so we don't get confused. Oh, I already did. All right, body has a background image of background tile.png. That's this little sort of mosaic kind of that you see behind it. You should be able to see that on the screen. Header, I give a width of 990 pixels to, so on. Nothing exciting there. Nothing exciting here. Nothing is really different until I get to this section. You remember before we said position absolute, and that put a certain number of pixels from the top and the left of the web page. This says position relative, then specifies 250 from the left, top, negative 380. What does that mean? It means this. Relative means relative to the position that the browser would want to normally place it. So if this wasn't here, if I didn't have that position there, the page would look like this. To put the section in the flow, all right, as we said before, just on top of each other. But we don't want it in the flow. We want it over from the left a certain number of pixels, and we want it up a certain number of pixels. So we put in a relative position. We want to push it from where it normally would be 250 pixels to the left, from the left towards the right. And we want it to go 150 or 380 pixels up. So when we put that relative position in, it moves it from where it otherwise would put it if it were in the flow, and it ends up being over here. We do the same thing with the footer. Push it up top, additional 350 pixels. I wouldn't use this very often, but if you did see a web page that someone else was working on and it was your job to change it, you should know what relative position means because you might need to change that. And sometimes it does come in handy. I think our next example shows an example where it comes in handy, if I'm not mistaken. Prototype 5. What's distinct about this is navigation stays fixed. This is a really nice feature because one of the keys as we identified, one of the keys of a well-designed web page is the user can get to where they want to go easily, and that the navigation is clear and it's easy for them to use. Well, in the other examples that we had, I think all the other examples that we had, navigation scrolled. So if you were at the bottom of this page, you'd have to go up to the top and then go to another link. So with this example, as we scroll, the navigation stays put. How do we do that? Do that with this is the wrong folder. Do that by making the navigation position fixed. Position fixed is different than position absolute. Position absolute, that content is glued in place on that position of the page, and if we scroll, it scrolls with us. So that's what position absolute means. Likewise, if we make a position relative, it scrolls with us. If, however, we say position fixed, it means it's going to be 10 from the top, 10 from the left. And as we scroll, it's not going to change. Other people have done things where they have put the navigation going horizontally across the screen in other cases. And as you scroll, navigation stays put. So this is a nice technique, and I could see for cases to use it really often, actually. Now, if you notice, we don't do much with the position of anything else except we give them left margins. For example, the header. If we did not give it a left margin, the header would appear over here. Well, we want to get it out of the way in the navigation. So we say, well, okay, push it 350 pixels to the side. So that's a way to sort of shift the web page over so that, this has enough room so it can scroll up and down. And we do that to all the other things on the page too. The rest of the stuff in all these style sheets you should look at and make sure that you understand. I'm just hitting the highlights and what's different in these style sheets than what we have seen before. All right. Our last example is about floating. Look, I have fancy drawings on these pages. See why I have those in a minute. That's what happens with this. When the browser is a certain size, these things appear side by side. When the browser width gets a certain width, however, those get stacked on top of each other. The whole idea of making your page so that it responds to the size of the window that's holding the page is called responsive web design. And it's something that we're going to talk more about the week after we get back from break. As you can imagine, responsive web design was always important because some people might be viewing the web page on a tiny Chromebook, for example, where other people might be viewing it on a giant, gigantic TV screen kind of monitor that's really big. But when mobile devices became popular for use on the web, responsive design became critical. Because what works on a desktop browser doesn't necessarily work on a mobile browser. When I say work, I mean it's not effective. So in a desktop browser, putting things side by side is no problem. But putting things on side by side in a mobile device is kind of a problem. So therefore, we want things sort of stacked on top of each other. And that's exactly what this example does and some of the other examples we're going to cover later. So let's look at, before we look at this one in detail, let's look at our float example. In this float example, we have two sections, a footer. Section 1, section 2, footer. Now, what we can do is we can float these things. What do I mean by floating it? By floating it, I mean pushing it in that direction. So in this case, I have the width of this being 45% and push it to the right. That's what that means. the screen is very wide, those things will be next to each other. As the screen gets narrower, when you add the 45% of the width, plus however amount we have for the padding and margin, we have a 20 pixel margin and a 10 pixel padding. Whenever that gets to be too wide for the screen, we drop them on top of each other. This might be easier to see if we started out, first of all, floating them to the left, because that's what you usually do. And giving an absolute number instead of a percentage. Then we'll build up the percentages. I'm going to make the width of this 400 pixels. So when these are, the window is big enough so that we can have the 400 pixel width, this, plus the padding and margin, and the 400 pixel width of this plus the padding and margin. If that fits going across, it will put them side by side. Whenever the window gets certain width and it no longer fits, in other words, the 400 width plus the padding and margin, it goes drop down below. What if we make this 600 pixels? When the browser window is big enough to hold the 600 pixels plus the padding and margin, boom, it drops it down below. Now, again, it works the same way with percentages, but it's a little more complicated. You can also use what's called a minimum width. So we could make the width 40%, let's say. But we could make the minimum width 500 pixels. So if we do this, okay, I did something wrong. Do like that, 40%, 40%, it can fit in the width. We make this, and we'll make it smaller till it reaches a certain point. This point, these are 500 pixels wide, and boom, drop down below. So that's the whole idea of floating. If there's space to put them side by side, it will. If there's not space, it will drop the second one below the first one. And you can float to the right, float to the left. You can float to the top and the bottom, but I rarely do that. So let's look at this last example for today. Then we'll just have a few more to talk about when we get back from break. Somewhat responsive because when it gets a certain width, as we make it bigger and smaller, it resizes the section and the header and the footer. When we get to a certain point, though, it drops it down below. So let's look at the CSS that does this. right, the header, we have a width of 95% and we float it to the left. Plus we have some padding, and do we have any margin? Not really. What that means is with this 95% plus some padding involved, there's going to be nothing that's going to sit to the right of this. So I can't float anything to the left and have it appear on the same line. So I know the navigation is going to be on it's going to appear underneath. Simply because no matter what the size of the navigation is, it's not going to fit alongside of this, so it's going to drop it down. Now, when we look at the navigation, we have a width of 25% and a minimum width of 200 pixels, which means that it will take up 25% of the page, but at a certain point, it does not get any smaller. All right? Plus the padding and margin and so on. Now the section has a width of 50%, so we notice it gets bigger and smaller. But it has a minimum width of, I lied, it doesn't have a minimum width. So we'll continue to make it smaller and smaller until it can't fit that 50% alongside of this, and it will drop it down below. Notice what I've done with images inside this. I have a bunch of images inside this home page. And I don't, they're just images by themselves. I don't have them in any container. My images, the CSS, I've said margin of 5%, width of 35%, maximum width 100 pixels. So if you notice, the images get bigger and smaller as we move across. And at the widest, 3 of them can fit side by side. As I make this smaller and smaller, at some point, well, I can't make it smaller than that, but I change this to, mess with that. But you get the idea. It can fit 3 alongside of each other, so it does that. When it can't, it changes it to 2 alongside each other. The reason for that is image tags by themselves are inline tags, so we don't need to float them because we only typically float block tags. Inline tags pretty much work like float anyhow. If it can put it on the same line, it will. If not, it puts it on the line below. It's not too early to start thinking about your project. Right? Let's look on Canvas and see when the design is due. I don't remember the exact date, but I know it's pretty soon, relatively soon. The design of the project is due March 29th. Okay, so you have less than a month left. You have in the neighborhood of 3 weeks left, right? And one of those weeks is your break week. So I don't know if you guys plan on working through break or not. I plan on working through break. So if you have questions, you feel free to email them. I'll still be doing my thing, grading and answering questions, maybe a little less intensely than I do during a normal week, but because I got to rest a little bit. But you don't have tons of time until this is due. So my suggestion is to spend some time over the break thinking of a topic and starting coming up with your design. You can always email me the design and have me verify that you're on the right track for it. And I recommend that you all do that. All right, if there are no questions, that's all I had for today. Have a great break. We will see you 2 weeks from now.